All right, welcome to Module 2. This is going to be the making of a scene presentation. Also, if you just watched the previous video, and again, I probably sent this in the video that I message out to everybody as a welcome, but I'm just going to show you. I renamed, well, I didn't rename because I didn't have one on my last video. But I just kind of want to show you something very quickly. Okay, so this is your module. Notice this is something that's been added since the last recording. I decided to call these lecture recordings. Okay, so the lecture recording is going to include my narration, me talking, the PowerPoint, and then any clips that I show within. Okay, just wanted to bring that up. And again, I know I'm going to be going over this in the welcome video, so apologies in advance for any sort of repeats. Okay, so let's actually get into the presentation today. So let me share my screen. All right, so we're going to be talking about making of a scene. This is just a primer. Again, we're going to go much more in depth on a lot of this material later on in the semester, or later on in the modules, I should say. This is just an entry. I want to get break the illusion of what goes into a movie and a scene and how a scene is actually constructed from shots and audio. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Let me get out my little annotate tool. All right, and again, just to clarify, we're on making of a scene, module 2. Okay. So this is just a behind the scenes photograph of classic era production. And I just kind of want to point out a few things. Notice what we're seeing in this frame here. We are seeing the interaction between 1, 2, 3 actors performing a scene on a stage, right? We are in a studio. It's a controlled environment, the stage, and there's some set dressing, production design here, a backdrop, but we have our 3 actors performing a scene, performing a written scene, just like something you would see like in theater, right? Now, if you kind of go one step further out, we start seeing the documentation, right? How are we documenting the act, the play, the actors performing the scene? Well, we're doing it with the camera. Notice this big camera here. This is an old film camera. And we're also recording audio. So the camera is photographing the actors as they play out their scene. And I'm going to assume just maybe where this is stationed at, it's probably maybe a 2-shot of the parents, or maybe even just a close-up of maybe the father, just the way that the the camera's angled, but who knows? But we'll pretend like it's just a wide shot and they're just filming the whole thing, right? So we're just photographing the act, and we're also recording it with audio. This is a boom pole with a microphone that's picking up the dialogue that the actors are speaking. And go one step further out, and this is something, we'll get to this in cinematography, but something to make very clear for film, right? I'm strictly speaking film, not digital necessarily, but film would take a lot of light to expose an image. You would need way more light than you would think by the eye, right? If we were sitting on the set and we were just looking, or if we were one of these crew members just watching the actors perform, it would look too bright. It would look too well lit. But our eyes have much stronger sensors essentially than a camera. And a camera needs light to expose an image. So that's why you're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I may be even missing a couple more. But all of these strong studio lights are directed towards the scene because we need to actually illuminate the subject to get an exposed image for the camera, which we'll talk all about later. But I just kind of want you to get this idea now, right? All film is the documentation of the play, the performance of a written scene. And then just before I move to the next one, obviously this is in terms of like dialogue scenes. That's really what we're mostly going to be talking about here. As we watch film and as you watch film, you probably notice that most movies are just a number of scenes of people talking to one another, right? They're dialogue scenes. Obviously, there's other sequences, you know, like action sequences as well, movement, montage sequences. But at the base level, it's usually just characters interacting with one another. Now, fast forward, I don't know, 60 years maybe even more. But this is a behind the scenes photograph of the movie The Martian. And I just kind of want to point out that not a lot has changed, right? The technology has changed, obviously. But if we compare this photograph to this photograph, it's pretty similar. What we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 actors in the frame, right? This is the play. We're seeing all these actors within the scene. And we're really focusing on Donald Glover and Kristen Wiig's character performing the written scene, right? This is the play. They're in a controlled environment. This looks like it's like an on-location shoot, not a studio, but they just built in some additional lights here. But we have 2 actors performing the written scene, the stage. They just play the scene from beginning to end, what's written on the page. Then we go one level further and we need to document. And what we're documenting, we are seeing cameras photograph the play. Camera 1, camera 2. Now this is a little bit different, right? Before we just saw one camera. Here we have double coverage essentially. And I'm going to show you the frames that we're seeing from each camera. So we have one camera positioned here that's possibly an over the shoulder on Kristen Wiig to Donald Glover. And then we have another camera here that's possibly a 2-shot with both Donald Glover and Kristen Wiig in the frame and our other actor in the background. And and I'll show you the pictures here, but you'll also see on the LCD screens on these cameras, give us a hint of what they're shooting. So the camera is photographing their performance. And again, just like the previous one, we see additional lights. These lights are LED panels, and we're seeing they're not nearly as, pervasive as the lights in this picture, but we still have quite a bit, right, to expose an image. Looks like we're shooting on digital cameras instead of film, but same ideas. And this here, our boom pole. Our boom pole is dropped down in the scene, recording the audio of our actors performing. So now let's start looking at this. So I'm going to go to one frame within the film, what we actually see in the movie. There we go. So that's our first, I say angle, and that's inaccurate. I should say setup, which we'll talk all about later. But here's our first setup. And we can see it's probably coming from this camera. So we see Donald Glover, Kristen Wiig, and then when we go to the next frame here, we also see the other actor, Chiwetel Ejiofor, is in the background. So we have our 2-shot with Donald Glover, Kristen Wiig in the foreground, Chiwetel Ejiofor in the background. Now I'm going to go back to behind the scenes, and now we'll see what this camera is photographing. I'll move to the next. Something like this. And I didn't even notice this, right? I didn't notice it. We have another actor right here, Jeff Daniels. And when we see the actual in-frame image, we see that in the frame. We have Kristen Wiig, Donald Glover, Sean Bean, Jeff Daniels. Does that make sense? So again, the camera is just photographing the play, the interaction between the actors in a scene. And this is just the idea of a 2-camera setup. So both the cameras are shooting these at the same time, these different angles on the scene. All right, so I just kind of wanted to set that up early. And again, we'll go much further in just a bit. So to kind of get an idea of what films are, I think the easiest way to process it is that films are just several scenes sequenced together. Or very rarely is a film a single scene. We'll have a number of scenes that are just placed in order. to get to the overall film. What is the scene? The scene is written. First, it's written on the page, which I'll show you an example of. Then when that scene is written, it's performed by actors in a location. So I'll kind of go back to our previous example. So we have our actors performing the scene in one location, look like an office location, and they're just performing the written scene from beginning to end. All right. While the actors are performing, they're not only saying the dialogue, but they're also figuring out, they're blocking in a scene. They usually do this with the director as well. But blocking is the working out, let me rephrase that. Blocking is just how the actors' movements are choreographed in a scene. So, when, for example, we see Donald Glover and Kristen Wiig standing next to each other. Okay, well, on what line is Donald Glover going to step back and hold up the stapler? Right, that's all blocking. It's choreography of the scene. So that is within the idea of playing out the scene with actors. Then the next level is we start to document, right? We actually have to document the play element, the actors performing the scene. So that performance is then documented with photography and audio. And this is where we get the shots. So again, I'll just kind of go back to this, right? Our cameras are photographing the different angles of the scene here. And just so you don't, I don't want to overwhelm you this early, but let's just focus, just for example, like this camera. Okay, let's pretend this is the only camera that's running in the scene for now. So I'm going to go and show you what that looks like, right? This is the shot that we're seeing. So as the actors are performing their scene from beginning to end, the camera is just documenting it from the start to the end in this setup, which again, we'll talk more about later. But this camera position, this setup for the camera to photograph the actors performing the scene. While we're gathering the shot, right? And again, I'll get to this later, but 1 second of film is 24 still frames. So just think of it like that, right? We're literally just photographing the actors play out the scene. And on top of that, we're also recording the audio. And then we get the shot. We get, say, I don't know, maybe like a 3-minute long shot of our actors performing the scene. Now, when we gather our shots, maybe we want to move the camera to a different position. Maybe we have more than one camera running at the same time, like I showed you in the previous picture. But we gather all of our shots together. And then the shots are then sequenced together to create the scene on a cinematic level. So if we go back to this idea, we have 2 cameras rolling at the same time. That's one camera. This is the other camera. And as you're shooting at the same time, the director with the editor is going to start sequencing those shots. When are we going to cut between this to this? The order of shots. And we just piece these shots together in the scene to create the scene as a whole piece. This will make more sense as we go, but I just kind of want to prime it early. Okay, so another way to kind of look at it, movies are made up of scenes. What is a scene? A scene is action that takes place in a single location in continuous time. So to clear that up, if we go back to our Martian example, if their scene ended and then the next scene is Donald Glover eating in a cafeteria, we have a new scene because we changed locations. Okay, so again, a scene is action that takes place in a single location in continuous time. If you change locations, then the scene has changed. Scenes are then made up of shots, right? As we saw, the shots are then pieced together in the edit to create a scene. And then several scenes are sequenced together to create the overall movie. So does that cycle kind of make sense? Okay. So again, the sort of 3 parts here of what makes a movie scene is, one is the play. So the recreation of a written scene between actors through blocking and reciting dialogue, just like what you would see like on stage, right? The actors just performing the scene and moving about the location. The second piece here are the shots. The shots captured by the camera to cover/document the play, to photograph the recreation of the written scene between the actors. And then the third part here is the editor takes this pool of footage, all of these different shots, and pieces them together in a certain sequence to create the scene that we end up seeing in the film. So we're going to actually kind of see this in practice. So in this next video, it's going to cut between two parts here. The first video, you're going to just see a scene out of a film, just as you would if you were to pop in the movie and start watching it. Something you've seen 1,000 times probably. It's just a dialogue scene between two actors in one location. So you're going to watch it as is, and then it's going to stop, and you're going to see another video right after. And that other video is going to be the behind the scenes B-roll of them shooting the scene. And I just kind of want you to note how it's executed. Notice that for certain parts, the camera is going to be moving to different positions to cover different aspects of the scene. And also that actors have to redo the scene a number of times. You'll see that as well. All right, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to stop the share here, and now I'm going to move over to there we go. Let me just kind of restart this.
You're not gonna believe this.
All right, let me just go back. I'm just gonna go ahead and get rid of this thing up top because I know it shows up on the recording.
You're not gonna believe this. These guys even figured out what's going on here at the studio, because the studio is nothing more than an instrument of capitalism. Yeah, so we blindly follow these laws like any other institution. The laws that these guys figured out. The studio makes pictures to serve the system. That is its function. That's really what we're up to here.
Is it?
Yeah, it's just confirming what they call the status quo. I mean, we may tell ourselves that we're creating something of artistic value, or there's some sort of spiritual dimension to the picture business, but what it really is this fat cat, Nick Skank, out in New York, running this factory, serving up these lollipops to the, what they used to call the bread and circuses for the,
Now you listen to me, Buster. Nick Skank and the studio have been good to you and to everyone else who works here. If I ever hear you bad-mouthing Mr. Skank again, it'll be the last thing you say before I have you tossed in jail for colluding in your own abduction.
Eddie, I would never do that.
Shut up! You're gonna go out there and you're gonna finish Hail Caesar. You're gonna give that speech to the feet of the penitent thief, and you're gonna believe every word you say. You're gonna do it because you're an actor, and that's what you do. Just like the director does what he does, and the writer and the script girl and the guy who claps the slate. You're gonna do it because the picture has worth, and you have worth if you serve the picture, and you're never gonna forget that again.
I won't forget, Eddie.
Damn right you won't. Not as long as I run this dump. Dad. Go out there and be a star.
Fat cat, Nick Skank, out in New York, running his factory, serving up these lollipops to people to pacify the...
No.
Like that?
Like that. Now, Bruce? Yeah. No, so can you hold that just for a second, Josh? And, no, can you go
You gotta go that way.
Yeah.
Nick Skank, out in New York, running this factory, serving up these lollipops.
Lollipops.
Okay. So I'm going to show you a little piece of the script here, and then we'll kind of go back to that. Okay. So this, and again, we'll kind of go back to that, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But let's go to the first level, right? the written scene, which is the script, which we'll talk all about 2 modules from now. But just to kind of give you an idea, right? You saw the finished scene, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you'll see, and I'm going to use my little annotate tool, Baird, George Clooney's character. Yeah, we're just confirming what they call the status quo. I mean, we might tell ourselves we're creating something of artistic value, that there's some kind of spiritual dimension to the picture business, but what it is this fat cat, Nick Shank, out in New York running a factory that makes these lollipops to pacify the... And then, right, that's when he's kind of going on in that long speech as Josh Brolin's character, Eddie, walks over and picks him up out of the chair. So notice the dialogue is on the page. This is what George Clooney was saying. Also the action, Eddie has grabbed Baird by the breastplate and hauled him to his feet. He now slaps him, forehand and backhand, slap, slap. Does that make sense? Right? We just saw that in the finished scene. You saw them perform the dialogue, perform this blocking, the choreography of what Eddie and Baird are going to do on a sort of an action level in the scene. So this is the written scene. And then we just saw the actors perform it, right? Both in the behind the scenes and in the actual finished version. Before I go to this, let me go back, because again, right, this is for the flexible online version. So normally we kind of talk about this, but I guess I will just kind of do a brief commentary on what we're seeing. And again, this is what I mean about participating. Hopefully you start kind of making these connections as I go here. But one thing I kind of wanted to point out, and again, we're going to break these shots down in a bit. Whoops. And I'm not even going to put on the sound. But for most of the first like 30 seconds of the scene, we cut back and forth between this shot of Baird and this shot of Eddie, right? They're both sitting down. It's the same sort of medium shot frontal position, which is something we'll talk about later. And then eventually we get a change of position. And let's just kind of look at this frame for a second, right? This high angle that's above Eddie onto Baird. Take note of this shot. And notice we only see it in the edit for, let's see. Okay, so we cut to this shot here, and not even a second, right? Not even a second do we have that shot. And I'll go back to it. This is the shot I'm talking about. About a second in the actual finished version. So this is what I'm talking about, of gathering different shots, right? You gathered this setup, actor performed the part of the scene, gathered this, is this actor performed this part of the scene. Bum, 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 bum. We have this shot, right? This is a new shot in the sequence. And then we have this shot, new shot of the sequence. Whoops, and I'm sorry, not this. This. So again, keep in mind, we're seeing that the camera's actually moving positions about the scene. And I want to go to the behind the scenes just for a second. So here's the behind the scenes. And we saw this, right? And how many times Josh Brolin and George Clooney had to kind of play out this part of the scene. But I'm going to go ahead and play it. And let me move that. And hopefully you can see my cursor. But notice on the top of the frame here, we can see the camera, right? The camera was stationed above George Clooney in this part of the scene. And I'll rewind it a bit here. So let me go ahead and I'll bring up my annotate tool. Oh, there we go. Okay. And hopefully I could hide this. It didn't do it. Let me try that one more time. Sorry. So I'm going to leave this here, but I think I could move it. So I'm going to move it below. So hopefully it's not blocking the screen. Okay, so I want us to focus up here. Okay, so we have our actor, Josh Brolin, over here. We have our other actor, George Clooney, over here. And notice, just like the picture from The Martian or from that old movie, we have our audio being picked up with the boom pole and the microphone. And then we also have our camera in our new position, right? That high angle that I kept pausing on, right? This is the idea. They actually had to move the camera. It's on this kind of like little crane, but they move the camera to be stationed above George Clooney for this little part of the scene, and we'll see it. And again, the camera's just in that position. He pulls him out of frame. Okay, and again, just to kind of give you an idea, that's what we were seeing. So again, normally I always ask things like, does that make sense? Are we seeing that? So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I just want to get to the idea that sometimes just bits of the scene are recorded. But you know, for these kind of longer parts like this and this, whoops, let me go back to Eddie. The camera was in that position and the actor would perform that part of the scene from beginning to end. But sometimes just little pieces are recorded and we get a new camera position like that. Okay. Let me go back to this. So hopefully that made sense. Okay. So to kind of go one step further, I'm going to talk about sort of the making of each part here. So making of the play, making of the shots, and making of the edit. So making of the play. What happens are the actors get the script, they learn their lines, they come to set, to the locations, the actors come to location, and they rehearse the written scene with the directors. This locks down blocking. When is Josh Brolin supposed to come over to the other side of the table and pick up George Clooney? Performance choices, how jokey should George Clooney deliver the monologue, stuff like that. So they rehearse the scene, and then the directors and cinematographer plan on how they want to document the scene. How do they want to photograph the scene? How are we going to shoot this scene with coverage? How are they going to gather the shots? When Josh Brolin picks George Clooney up out of the chair, are we going to shoot that from a super high angle that's above Clooney? Or are we going to just shoot this all in a wide shot, right? Those are all choices in shots. So then making of the shots. Again, a scene is made up of shots, one, sometimes more, but usually one. One camera is stationed at a specific setup. A setup is a shot scale, angle, and position. We'll talk all about that in cinematography to cover a scene from beginning to end. That's usually what we see. And we'll talk about master scene technical later, but in like dialogue scenes, if there's not major blocking, usually see like only 3 setups. It'll be like a medium shot of actor 1, a medium shot of actor 2, and then something called a master shot, which is a wide shot of both actor 1 and actor 2 in the frame. And we just cut between those 3 shots back and forth. And it goes from beginning to the end of the scene. Now, if directors want to do additional setups, they can decide to, like what we saw in the Hail Caesar scene. So the camera is then moved to cover another side of the scene. The actors reperform the entire scene. Sometimes only parts of a scene are reperformed for major blocking changes, like what we saw with the pulling George Clooney out of the frame. And then sometimes only small moments of the scene are captured in a shot, like inserts or establishing shots, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so then the making of the edit. These separate shots are then edited together for the final scene. We cut back and forth between shots. I want to make this very clear. A cut is whenever we see a new shot in the sequence. Now, even if it's a shot that was already set up earlier, like we saw it earlier in the scene, if we're coming back to it, that's a cut. So if you're watching a movie and you see a new shot in the sequence, that is a cut. Because what we're doing is we're selecting other shots to cut back to, either cutting later in time within another shot, cutting to a new shot entirely, that's a cut. So we take all these shots together and we start sequencing them as a scene. We start cutting between Clooney sitting down, he says his monologue, then cut to Josh Brolin going, then cut back to George Clooney finishing his monologue, right? Those are cuts. So a cut is whenever we see a new shot in sequence. In reality, filmmakers are cutting back and forth between the shots. A scene with only 2 shots could have 100 cuts. We'll talk all about that more in editing. Okay. Just to keep note, every shot is a recorded setup. So again, I'll talk more about this because I actually have each setup blocked out. So I'll come back to that. But think of it like taking a picture. So again, I talked about this, but you set up the camera, you get your framing right. This is what I want to photograph. And as soon as you hit record, you start collecting frames. 24 still frames equals 1 second of film. So yes, we'll talk more about this later. Right now, just keep in mind that segments of a scene are recorded one piece at a time. So again, for like the Martian example, we saw 2 cameras running at the same time. But for the Hail Caesar thing, we saw that there's only 1 camera. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this for a second. So these are all of the setups. Now I call them shots. Again, shots are just recorded setups. But take note of what we're seeing. And again, we'll talk about shot scale and everything later. But this is considered a medium shot. We're not super close to Eddie in this frame. And we're not super far away. But if we just sort of, well, actually, let's go back. I'm going to actually just kind of focus on something really quickly. So I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to re-share the video. Okay. So I thought it'd be easier if we actually go back to the video, and I'll go back to the still frames. But just to kind of give us an idea, I'm going to talk a little bit more over this. Okay. So let's start looking at this. I'm going to move to the first kind of steady setup here. So let's just focus on like the first 40 seconds of this scene before Eddie gets up from his chair. So this is our setup. And I'll find pause here. So this is the setup I was starting to kind of get into on the stills. So the camera is positioned here. We are in a tighter medium shot from the first one. Right, notice that this is a little bit wider. Now we get a little bit closer on the second setup of Eddie. I'm sorry, of Baird, which I will talk about on the stills in the PowerPoint. But I just kind of want to focus on this for a second. So this is the setup. And as we're kind of parked on this position, the camera is just recording. It's collecting, right? This is just, right now I'm paused on 1 frame. But if I press play, we're just recording the action at 24 frames per second as he's performing inside of a scene. So we have this setup, and this is mostly what we have in Baird's side of the scene before he gets picked up from the chair. And if I go to Eddie, this camera position, I'm sorry, this setup, I should say, we are in about a medium frontal of Eddie. And notice, just like what we saw with Baird, we're parked in this setup. Right now I'm parked on just 1 frame. And if I press play, I think you see him sort of like nod his head. Right? So again, we're just collecting that moment of the scene. And that is really the only setup we have of Eddie in this scene. But if we keep watching it, if we keep watching it, we cut back to Baird talking, cut back to Eddie responding. So that's a cut. Does that make sense? It's the same setup, but we're seeing a new shot in the sequence, right? We go from Eddie, nod, back to Baird talking, cut back to Eddie reacting. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to re-emphasize. I don't know if that's a word. I think so. But I guess to clear that up a little bit. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. And let's start looking at these individual setups. So this is the first one we see of Baird, medium shot, but it's a little bit wider than the second setup we have, but it's towards the beginning part of the scene. Then the second shot we have is that setup that I just talked about with Eddie, that we cut back to a few times in the first like 40 seconds of the scene. Then we have our third shot in sequence, right? Our third unique setup. And it's a medium shot, but it's a little bit tighter, right? Notice there's less space in the frame in comparison to the first one. Whoops. And also the angle is a little bit higher. We'll talk all about this stuff when we get to cinematography. Okay, And now in that first like 40 seconds, we are just cutting between this, this, and this. This is in the beginning, then we cut from this shot to this shot a few times in that sequence, this setup, right? Just at later moments in the shot. Now I want to just kind of pause. Those three setups are what make up the first 46 seconds of the scene. The Coens, these are the filmmakers, they're the writers, directors, and editors. The Coens are just cutting back and forth between these three shots as the scene progresses. Then when we get a blocking change, we get new setups to cover this part of the scene. So once Josh Brolin picks up George Clooney and now they're standing, we can't just keep recording at these setups, right? They would be out of frame. So now we have to actually move the camera. And that's what we started to see in the behind the scenes photograph. But this is a new setup that we have within the sequence. It's a wide shot, medium shot, low over the shoulder as Eddie approaches Baird. We'll talk about this stuff later, but over the shoulder just means that, and I'll use my annotate tool here. Over the shoulder just means that we have part of Baird's shoulder in the frame. So Eddie gets up from the table, he approaches Baird. This is a new shot in the sequence to cover this moment of action. Shot number 5 is that high over the shoulder of Eddie on Baird as he picks up Baird out of the frame. Shot 6, close up over the shoulder to Baird. So it's an over the shoulder of Eddie, close up of Baird. And again, notice that the position is completely changed, right? We actually picked up the camera, raised it, moved the position. We have a completely, new setups here. Shot 7, close up of Eddie over the shoulder of Baird. And if you notice, and we'll rewatch the scene again, but as Eddie is like slapping Baird and he starts giving him his speech, towards the end of the speech, the camera pushes in. We'll talk about camera movements later, but the camera literally starts to push in towards Eddie as he speaks. It's not on a dolly, but it's a similar movement to a dolly in or a push in. Okay, so that's what we see. And notice when we push in, the scale becomes tighter, right? We get a more tight on Eddie's face. Shot 8, medium shot over the shoulder on Eddie to Baird. Shot 9, it's a wide shot as Eddie approaches the desk. And this is something I'm just introducing now, but this is also a subjective shot. Another way to look at it is that this is coming from the point of view of another character, right? As we see this frame, it looks like we are seeing Eddie from Baird's eyes, right? This is where we saw Baird, and now we're watching Eddie approach his desk from Baird's point of view. Shot 10, it's a wide shot, and now it's sort of a subjective POV shot from Eddie's point of view, right? Eddie's sitting down, he's looking at Baird at the door. So this is a wide shot, subjective, low angle. We'll talk all about this stuff more in depth with cinematography, but just so we're starting to introduce this stuff, that's why I'm saying it now. But this is our 10th shot in the sequence. Shot 11 is a medium shot of Eddie in the chair, and I believe that's the last shot. Okay, so we have 11 unique setups in the scene to cover all of the action and dialogue from beginning to end. We'll talk more about the 180-degree rule later, but I'll introduce it now. So the 180-degree rule is a blocking rule, essentially. So it's an old school blocking rule to make sure eye lines match, and it helps in the edit for continuity. Notice in the sample scene how we always stay on one side of the room. The first shot sets the line. We already talked about what blocking is. Continuity is keeping blocking consistent shot to shot, so this collection of shots can seamlessly connect in the finished scene. I'll talk more about this in a second. Let me show you there's a graphic here. So we didn't get a master shot in the scene. Again, a master shot, which again, a lot of my content sort of folds into itself over and over. So we'll talk more about this stuff later, but just to kind of set it up now, a master shot if we have like a dialogue scene between two people, is a wide shot that features both subjects in the frame, a two shot. That usually sets the line because we cover the scene from beginning to end in that wide shot. And then once we're done, we then move in for coverage. So we'll introduce this shot, which will be a close-up on this subject, this shot, which will be a close-up on this subject. And they just perform the scene from beginning to end. They're sides of the scene. Whatever side of the room you decide to have your first setup, so your master shot, the 180-degree rule is that you have to kind of obey that line of the room. So if this is our first shot, right, this is our master shot, you create sort of an imaginary 180-degree line between the subjects. And if you were to have your camera set up on this side of the room, you'll start to see that eye lines no longer match. It becomes disorientating. Okay, and just to sort of get an image for it, I'm gonna go back to our stills. So this is the first shot we see in the sequence. And think about that 180-degree line. So think about like there's an imaginary line between Clooney on this side of the table and Brolin on this side of the table. And notice our setups are, the camera's never gonna be positioned on this side of the room. We're always gonna see like the windows and in like the background. We're never jumping over. We get close, but we never quite jump over that imaginary line. And another thing, keep note of where your subjects are positioned in the frame, which again, we'll talk all about later, but notice Clooney sort of dominates the left to center of the frame, while Brolin is more right to center. And every setup for them follows through on that. And notice we haven't crossed over, right? We're still on that side of the room. Still on this side of the room, right? We're not shooting from this side. Subjects are still occupying their thirds of the frame. Brolin right, Clooney left. Again, we still haven't crossed over. And there we go. Right? We never shoot from this side of the room. All right. So we're gonna watch this scene again. I would like you to take note of how many unique setups you're seeing in the scene. Again, my count was 11. Is that right? Yep, 11. So double check my count. I might have got it wrong. And then also, this is important. And again, I know you're doing this on your own, but if you have, hopefully you're taking notes, have a piece of paper and literally start taking a tally of every cut that you see. Remember, a cut is whenever you see a new shot in the sequence, not a unique setup. That is different, right? There are 11 unique setups, but there can be, again, as I mentioned before, a dialogue scene could have 2 setups and we could cut 1,000 times if we wanted to. We're just cutting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So count, double check my shot / setup count, count how many cuts are in the scene, compare the number of shots to the number of cuts. Also notice the 180-degree rule being used in this scene, how we're always on one side of the room after the first shot establishes the line. Note how Baird favors the left side of the frame and Eddie the right. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and replay that video.
You're not going to believe this. These guys even figured out what's going on here at the studio, because the studio is nothing more than an instrument of capitalism. Yeah, so we blindly followed these laws like any other institution, the laws that these guys figured out. The studio makes pictures to serve the system. That is its function. That's really what we're up to here.
Is it?
Yeah, it's just confirming what they call the status quo. I mean, we may tell ourselves that we're creating something of artistic value, or there's some sort of spiritual dimension to the picture business, but what it really is this fat cat, Nick Skank, out in New York, running this factory, serving up these lollipops to the, what they used to call the bread and circuses for the,
Now you listen to me, Buster. Nick Skank in the studio have been good to you and to everyone else who works here. If I ever hear you bad-mouthing Mr. Skank again, it'll be the last thing you say before I have you tossed in jail for colluding in your own abduction.
Eddie, I would never do that.
Shut up! You're gonna go out there and you're gonna finish Hail Caesar. You're gonna give that speech to the feet of the penitent thief and you're gonna believe every word you say. You're gonna do it because you're an actor and that's what you do. Just like the director does what he does and the writer and the script girl and the guy who claps the slate. You're gonna do it because the picture has worth. And you have worth if you serve the picture and you're never gonna forget that again.
I won't forget, Eddie.
Damn right you won't. Not as long as I run this dump. Dad. Go out there and be a star.
Okay, so I'm not going to show the behind the scenes video again. I don't think we need to see that. I was just making a note there. Okay, but I'm going to stop the share and let's talk. See, I'm so used to that. We can't talk about it, but before I reveal my number of cuts, I really hope I'm going to give you a second here to kind of reflect, because it's very important that we understand the difference between setups and editing and cuts and noticing cuts. So how many cuts did you count? Give you a pause there. Okay, now compare the number of cuts to the number of setups. All right, so now I'm going to reveal what I got. So again, I had 11 unique setups. And then I had about 30 cuts in the scene. Again, the amount of times that we're cutting, we're switching between different shots. And again, it's whenever we see a new shot in the sequence. And just because I have the ability to do it, I'm going to take advantage of the technology here. And I'm going to go back. And let's look at this for a second. I'm going to start here. So let's get to, we'll talk about a few things here. But here we go. I kind of want to go one back. So Clooney gets picked up from the chair. Okay. Now, for the most part, when they're sort of squared up, right, this part of the scene, this blocking part, when they're squared up and Brolin is giving his monologue and he's like slapping Clooney. For Clooney, and I'm going to use my little annotate tool, we're sort of in this setup for most of the scene. Close up, right? So it's kind of over the shoulder close up. And it's covering his side of this part of the scene. Slap. Okay. Now we have a cut, right? We see a new shot in the sequence. So now we have Brolin's side of the scene. Close up, Baird. I'm sorry, getting the names mixed up. Close up, Eddie. And for the most part, we just cut between these two setups. So we have a cut. Cut, right? We cut back to Clooney's side of the scene here, this shot. Cut. 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 Is this making sense? Right? There hasn't been a new setup introduced, right? We're just cutting between those same two setups back and forth. Okay. And I think this is where we start to see the camera push in. Oh, maybe not. There we go. It's very subtle, but notice the camera pushing in towards Eddie's face. And notice that we also didn't cut during that. So that's duration. We held on that shot a little bit longer as the camera slowly pushed in. Okay. So hopefully that made sense. I'm going to go back. Whoops. Let me stop share. go back to that. So I had 11 setups counted, and I counted about 30 cuts. We'll talk all about editing later, but just to kind of give you an idea, editing is all about selection, order / sequence, and duration. So some of these shots were held for a very short amount of time, right? When Brolin was slapping George Clooney, when we get a close-up of George Clooney, sometimes we only hold on that shot for less than a second, right? That's duration. So some cuts can be really fast. Sometimes we can manipulate the duration and hold on a shot for extra long. Cuts can be a single frame in length. So we can hold on a shot from 1 frame if we wanted to. Again, there's 24 frames in 1 second of film. Anything that's like 6 frames, well, really like 12 frames or less is considered a flash frame because it's almost subliminal. It comes up on the screen very quickly. Okay. I do want to talk about production roles. So before I do, I hope that made sense. I hope we understand how scenes are put together, the idea of playing out the scene from the page, photographing it, getting all the different setups to cover it, then editing between those setups, and understanding the difference between setups and cuts. We'll go much further, but I just kind of want to set it early. Okay, so let's talk about some major production roles. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm going to talk about some of them today. We have the director, the screenwriter, producer, cinematographer or director of photography, actors, crew. And crew, there are many crew levels and different positions, but we have like sound crew, lighting crew, production design / wardrobe, script supervisor. Excuse me. And then we also have the editor. And there are several other post-production crew levels as well, like, for example, computer graphics and titles, color grading. Those are all different positions, but we're going to focus on the editor as sort of our primary post-production role. Okay, the director. We'll talk more about directors as we go, but for our class, a good takeaway is to think that the director is the creative filter of the film, right? All of the formal choices are filtered through them in some way. So the director realizes on the screen an artistic vision of the screenplay. They cast the actors and direct their performances. They mold their performances. They give them performance ideas. Work closely with the production design and creating the look of the film, including the choice of locations. So selecting locations with the location scout, designing locations. What wall colors should this location be? What props should be in the scene? Oversees the work of the cinematographer and other key production personnel. So cinematographer is the person who's responsible for the photographic elements. So what's the lighting going to be? Where's the camera going to be positioned? How many setups do we want in this scene to cover it? Supervises all post-production activity, especially editing, usually giving notes on the edit. Maybe we can, you know what, I want to hold on this shot for a couple seconds longer. I actually want to remove a couple frames here. But essentially they translate the words on the page into scenes. The director is the creative filter of the movie. So the director gets the script, then they decide how that scene is going to sort of be played out between the actors, give performance notes, then how are we going to photograph it, then how are we going to edit it together. They are the creative filter. Even if they're not doing everything specifically, right, that maybe they're not necessarily looking down why am I blanking? The viewfinder on the camera. They are working with the cinematographer on how this camera setup should look. The screenwriter. The screenwriter is responsible for coming up with the story, either from scratch or by adapting another source, such as a novel, play, memoir, or a news story. They build the narrative structure of the film from the beginning, middle, and end, or Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, or the setup, confrontation, and resolution. We'll talk all about that later. But it's important to note that the screenwriter creates every character, the actions that characters take in a given scene, or the character's will to act. They write every line of dialogue for the characters in a scene and describe the setting. Producer. Producer is pretty broad. Producers can serve a variety of different positions on a production, but I kind of boil it down here. The producer essentially guides the process of making the film. They're with the film from script to post. There's different roles of producers. So like, for example, a studio may assign a producer to be on set when a movie's being shot to make sure everything's on schedule, keeping the studio's best interests and keeping the shoot on schedule. Then you can have independent producers, and independent producers can do a number of things. Independent producer might have a movie idea. They sit down with a screenwriter and tell the screenwriter the idea and say, hey, can you make a script out of this? Okay, here's a note, here's a note. They develop the script, then they have a project. Now they're gonna shop this project out to different financiers to raise funding for a film. They can maybe shop it to studios to see if they will buy it. It can really range, but often they're trying to either develop a project or find funding for a project, oversees production and distribution. They may locate a script or commission a writer to write a script based off an idea, develop the script, then bring to a studio. Really, the only thing you gotta know about producers is that they're responsible for the organizational and financial aspects of the production. They often help locate financing for a film as well. But the key one here is the idea of they're the sort of the organizational and financial aspects on a production, less creative. Cinematographer. This is the person who makes the very specific decisions about how the movie will be photographed. They're in charge of cinematographic properties of the shot, from film stock, lighting, and lenses. Film stock's an odd inclusion. But we'll talk about cinematography in depth with the 5 elements of cinematography. So just kind of keep in mind, right, another word for cinematographer is director of photography. They're the person who's in charge of kind of supervising all 5 elements of cinematography: the lighting, the setup, camera movement, composition, and color palette, which we'll get to later. They're in charge of framing of the shot, proximity to the camera, depth of field, camera angle and height and shot scale, camera movement, speed and length of the shot. I don't know if I really go with that last bullet point, because at the end of the day, it's up to the editor of how long they want to hold on a shot. But yeah. Okay, the actor. The actor is the person who portrays a character via performance. Actor uses imagination, intelligence, psychology, memory, vocal techniques, facial expressions, and body language to realize a character on screen. Styles can vary greatly. Some actors have years of training, and it may be from like the method. It can be from more of a theater background. Some actors have no formal training. Often the director works in collaboration with the actor to get the proper performance. So the director's kind of coaching the performance usually. And this is also, I don't gender actor, right? It's just like a role on a production. So if you hear like the term actress, you know, if you want to use actor, actress, that's fine. But the Screen Actors Guild removed the term actress, and actor is just to describe performers of any gender. So just know that if I'm ever saying actor, I'm not, you know, putting like a gender code on it in any way. I just think it's more, what's the word? Honestly, just progressive, in my opinion, if we just use actor. Okay. Editor. The editor is the person who assembles shots into a coherent piece. They take the film, the director/crew capture and manipulate that footage to create a movie. Again, the idea of piecing together all the different shots into a scene. The technique involves cutting the desired shots and joining them together. You can completely rewrite the film by rearranging scenes, rearranging shots in the scene, cutting out scenes, cutting out lines of dialogue within shots, excuse me, and using juxtaposition to create a point. We'll talk more about thematic juxtaposition when we get to editing. The director is often heavily involved in the editing process. Usually the editor will do something like an assembly cut that joins like all the footage that they gathered out in the field into a rough edit that resembles the script. And then the director will come in and start giving kind of minute notes on editing strategies. That being said, if it's a studio film, often the studio or the production has a little bit more oversight on the edit of the film than the director. And if they wish to, they can take the edit away from a director and edit it however they want. Okay, so we are about done with this module, but I just want to be clear. Notice of content is active starting the next module. All right, so starting with the next module, the clips presented will feature explicit content. If you have any concerns, please email me, zbasada@mchenry.edu. All right, so that's it. I will see you next module, module number 3.